Hi, and welcome into this Telstra Virtual Event. I'm Justin Cleveland, and today we're talking about security and how to have the conversation within your business to better secure your business, finding out those assets, and how to have the conversation up the chain. To do that, we have the author of The 5 No's of Cybersecurity, Rachael Falk, National Security Advisor, here joining us. We'll get into all of the material in just a moment. First, I want to let you know what you can do with the Telstra Virtual Event platform. Feel free to move around the boxes on your screen, resize them however you see fit. You can also click around, see speaker bios down at the bottom of your screen. Also, feel free to submit questions during the course of today's event. We'll be taking them as they come in, and also have a dedicated time for questions at the end. Really, a lot of what we talk about today is going to be driven by you, so feel free to submit those questions. Let's go ahead and officially introduce our speaker today. That's Rachael Falk. She is a National Security Advisor and General Manager of cybersecurity, of policy and compliance, of a whole host of things. Welcome in, Rachael Falk.
Thank you. Thanks very much for... Go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, so before we get into the 5 No's of cybersecurity, I want to ask you in the audience a question. That is, have you ever engaged owners or C-level executives on cybersecurity in your business? Yes, and they were receptive. Yes, but they were not receptive. No, but I'd like to. And Rachael, I want to start out by asking you now a little bit about your background, first of all. Now, you have a legal background, and what brought you into policy and compliance and the cybersecurity side here within Telstra?
Yes, that's right, Justin. I do have a legal background. I practiced law for 15 years, but increasingly the kind of law and things I was doing were more around data breaches and how we can make sure our customer and corporate data is kept safe. So I decided that it was far more interesting to do a lot of the commercial work around that, and to start really exploring actually some of these issues about engaging C-level, C-suite executives around cybersecurity, because I saw even in the legal community there needed to be a lot more engagement even with lawyers. So I became really interested in some really challenging aspects of cyber, and decided to jump the fence about 3 years ago.
Yeah, so looking at the results of our poll questions, about 39.3% say yes, they have engaged C-level or executives on cybersecurity and they were receptive, which is great, and better, just about 43% say they would like to, that they have not yet. And that's really what we're going to dive in today, is to have that conversation. So I'll hand things off now to Rachael Falk as she dives into the 5 No's of cybersecurity.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks everyone for attending today. I'm going to talk to you about the 5 No's of cybersecurity and what they certainly mean for us generally, not just what they mean for Telstra. And I'm happy to take questions at the end. But just before I get into the 5 No's, I'm going to be talking a bit about the threat environment, the nature and impact of the cyber threat, the barriers to understanding it, what we call our 3 distractions, and then I'll ultimately get into the 5 No's. As I said, I'm happy to take questions at the end, or if you do have a burning question, you can stop, but I prefer just to collate them all at the end. So I think we might go to the first slide. And this is really about the cyber threat from inside and outside an organisation. So as you can see on that slide there, it's really the impact of all sorts of cyber threats that we have and around the world. And every day the world is presenting us with the examples of cyber threats. There's the Anthem cyber breach with 80 million medical records. And this really, if there were an example, and not to pick on an individual company, but that would show that cyber is really a matter of global importance. I think what it's important to understand about cyber, and the challenge for all of us, is it's the pace, scale and reach of cyber that means that attacks can happen at an unprecedented scale and reach. So cyber crime is just crime, and cyber espionage is just espionage. But it's the pace, scale and reach of cyber, so the conduit that everything runs through, just makes its impact much larger. What would have taken a long, long time in the real world takes seconds in the cyber world. So it really is a matter of global importance. But what this slide demonstrates is that you can have an impact from a range of areas. A cyber breach or hack or attack can result in financial loss for companies. It can result in legal action, certainly reduced productivity with senior managers and a whole range of people throughout a company being involved in not just remediating an immediate breach, but also remediating the aftermath, reporting to regulators, and also potentially stock exchanges and all sorts of other regulators involved. So even a small incident or attack can have major consequences for an organisation. I'll also talk a bit about the 3 distractions, and you'll see some slides about those. We call them attribution distraction, threat distraction, and vendor distraction. And not like the 3 little pigs or the 3 little bears, there's no sweet ending and the third isn't the charm. All these distractions are unhelpful, and I'll explain why they're unhelpful and why it's important, really, when understanding the value of your organisation, the value of information to your organisation and what you can do about it. It's really helpful to focus on what's important and not the 3 distractions. So moving on to the first distraction, which will then frame the 5 no's, is what we call attribution distraction. And you may have seen in media reports over, certainly every day we see a cyber breach, you'll often see lots of media headlines, depending on how big the breach is, around who did it, who done it, and where it came from, and particularly country of origin. This seemed to reach fever pitch during the Sony hack and attack, and that's what the slide sort of depicts, a range of different headlines during that time. I think it's important, and we always say this internally too, don't let who did it attribution distract you or distract an organisation from the task at hand, which is understanding what's happening during the incident. Certainly in the Sony case, they had a big incident. It was a hack and attack. Not only did they have data destroyed, but they also had data stolen from them. But the destruction and deletion of data meant they couldn't file their quarterly financial results. So they were very consumed with, understandably, that breach. But at the time, there was so much attention on who did it, when really the focus should always be, and I'm not saying that was generated by Sony at all, and I'm sure they certainly didn't want as many headlines as they got, that's for sure. But it's important to focus on really remediation and working out what actually happened and how it happened. More often than not, we see that the claims during attribution distraction and the claims that companies were hacked or attacked by very sophisticated operators, or they couldn't have done much about it. In our experience, when we looked at certainly a range of data breaches, most techniques were not sophisticated and could have been prevented if organisations had known the value of their data and taken steps to protect that data. So the solution seems to be to hype up the threat and look at attribution rather than focusing really on what's important. So in this situation, I would always suggest don't focus on the whodunit. It's a very natural question to ask, but there's time to unpack and work out who did it, and that's often well and truly after an event. Attribution is something that needs to be done in slow time. It is very detailed and it requires deep expertise that many of us simply don't even possess. I should also caution something you might have heard our CISO Mike Burgess or me talk about in the past. Attribution is not always, it cannot always be precise. It can be mimicked. You can think a threat comes from one way and in fact it can come from another origin. So again, we caution about making hasty statements about attribution, and the focus is do not get distracted. Do not let others distract you on coming out with statements around we think so-and-so did it, we think the country of origin is X. It's really important to stay focused on what's important. The next of our distractions that we talk about is threat distraction. And this is often around what happens to an organisation when they are breached. And we did a bit of an analysis. Around what happens when large companies are breached. And there's no doubt that when a company is breached, they go into panic mode and certainly, no doubt, crisis management mode. But more often than not, we saw that instead of focusing perhaps on customer first, what's important to get back on track, there was a lot of emotive language used in media releases around how they were attacked and that they were almost indefensible. They couldn't defend themselves. For example, in the Home Depot, which was a large consumer store in the US, they were hacked, and they said in the media release the malware used in the attack had not been seen in any prior attacks and was designed to evade detection by antivirus software. Again, it's unusual to see sophisticated malware like that, but anyway, that's interesting. Anthem, so the company I mentioned before with 80 million medical records taken, we have state-of-the-art information security systems to protect your data. However, despite our efforts, Anthem was the target of a very sophisticated external cyber attack. And Sony, likewise, was a brazen cyber attack, and in an internal memo they said it was unprecedented in nature, malware was undetectable by industry-standard antivirus software, the attack was an unparalleled and a well-planned crime, carried out by an organised group which neither Sony Pictures nor other companies could have been fully prepared. I would challenge that. I would challenge the brazen and the very sophisticated. Often the weak point is a socially engineered email or a phishing email that's been sent into an organisation. And these are very common intrusion methods. And some of you may have seen these in your organisation, or certainly that your organisations talk about phishing campaigns and to be aware of clicking on links. I think from my perspective, the word sophisticated when it comes to explaining to your customers that you were done over by something sophisticated implies helplessness, that particular attack was just not preventable because it was just so sophisticated it evaded our state-of-the-art detection. That's certainly true, I would say, in certain cases where there are state-based actors, and there is no doubt there are state-based actors with extremely sophisticated capabilities, and that is absolutely right. It would be very difficult to defend against that. However, I would probably argue that these not necessarily all the work of such sophisticated actors. And certainly some of the major breaches that have been evaluated have shown that the common method of attack was a phishing email sent into an organisation they sent it to enough people who clicked on links. So these are not new. And I think out of this we would always say that the threat environment is here to stay. You are always going to get threat actors who will send in either very sophisticated socially engineered emails to your CEOs and your leadership team, or you're going to get phishing emails sent around, and they will come in the standard form of emails that your organisation's probably received today, purporting to be a parcel waiting for you, a FedEx to pick up, a parking fine, a speeding fine, possibly Telstra emails or refund payments, which we've had lately. They are here to stay. That is the new. So again, we would say don't focus on waiting for that moment perhaps when you can say that something was so sophisticated. And that's the beauty of the 5 no's, is perhaps preparing and being on the front foot should anything occur. So we say don't focus so much on the threat distraction and the attribution distraction, but move forward and focus on what we can do about it. So the next slide was going to be vendor distraction, but we don't in fact have it there. I'll talk briefly about vendor distraction, but again, that slide just shows some of the adjectives used by technology and how it's also very easy in this industry when you're talking about cybersecurity for everyone to want to talk to leadership and boards, and in fact maybe even your IT or cybersecurity people have talked to you about networks and firewalls and great whiz-bang new technical solutions. Again, making it a technology issue makes it seem like it's almost too big to tackle, and it's just, if we get more technology in and more firewalls, it'll magically go away. Unfortunately, that's not quite right. There's no single security solution that will ever provide 100% effective security. Vendors will always try and convince you that their product is fantastic and it's great from a security perspective, and that's not a criticism of vendors. I'm sure they all are. And we have some fantastic products we use here at Telstra. But it's not all just about technology. It's not all about one thing you'll ever need. There is no tool in a box, security in a box, you just pop off and that will be your 100% assurance. We say, we certainly talk a lot about here at Telstra, and it's important to remember that it's just as much a human issue as it is a technical one. There is a place and time for tools and technology, and it is fabulous. And in fact, I've said before in other audiences, some of the tools and technology we use at Telstra really helps us uncover how our staff are using tools and what our staff are doing, and not in any sort of surveillance way, but it really gives us enormous insight. And for that, I'm always eternally grateful, given the role that I have with my team about helping to understand how people perceive cybersecurity and how people treat information. But we also place a lot of importance on raising awareness at Telstra and raising awareness about how this is also a human issue. So I just say, please this is particularly important for any of you who are addressing your senior leaders or who want to engage your C-suite. You can't just make this discussion one about tools, tech. And that's why when you go into the 5 no's and I talk about that, you'll understand why that becomes more important. And the other sort of distraction I just urge you to be on the lookout for when talking cybersecurity, I don't have a slide, but I can talk to it anyway, is also what we call framework and compliance and InfoSec standards distraction. there's a lot of talk in this industry, and it really struck me when I came from being a lawyer into this group, is there's a lot of talk out there in the industry about ISO 27001 or being compliant with ISO 27001 or compliant with PCI or compliant with other standards. There's absolutely a place and a time for a standard, and it's absolutely important that standards do measure what you're doing and what an organisation is doing to get on the path to effective cybersecurity outcomes. However, blind adherence to a framework without actually checking with the operational guys that it's actually in place won't work. I've seen quite a few times in the few years I've been in this role where people say that such and such an organisation is ISO 27001 compliant, and yet when you poke this a bit, you find out that things aren't in place that should be. I would urge all of you to make sure that you don't undergo compliance, but make sure it's to ensure that there are effective security outcomes at the end of it. Don't just do it if you want a sick exhibit to an affidavit should you ever be sued one day on the back of an attack. Don't use it as that sort of reassurance to your board or to your risk audit committees that we've got it covered because we've got these frameworks in place. Frameworks and the Excel spreadsheets are absolutely part of it, and they're really helpful in understanding roles and responsibilities, but it is vital that you're doing the back-end operational bits as part of that compliance program, and that you're doing them for the right outcome, not doing them simply to assure your board that you have some sort of framework in place. Because I would certainly argue that the 5 no's, irrespective of any framework, will get you partway there, as will in using ASD's either top 4 or top 35 mitigation strategies. Blind adherence to frameworks can also lead a lot of teams down a path that invests a lot of effort, but doesn't always, again, as I say, result in effective security outcomes. So please be on the lookout for that. So now we may just turn into the 5 no's. And the reason we talk about the distractions first is because we often find a lot of effort is invested in the distractions, and perhaps really the effort should be focused on how did this happen? How was it that people were able to exfiltrate data out of an organisation? How was it that sensitive employee data was lost from an organisation? And we believe that 5 no's is a new way of looking at it, and a unique way of looking at it, because we put the value of the information at the core of what it's about, and then the protection of that comes afterwards. So just taking everyone through the 5 no's, the first no is know the value of your data. And what that's about is it's not the dollar value. Some people do ask, does that mean we have to quantify all the valuable bits of data? What I say to an organisation is get your leadership team in a room, or if you've got a large organisation like Telstra, many leadership teams in a room, you need to go down the inventory of what information in your organisation is of value to your organisation. And by that I mean, if it was lost or stolen, will cause you real pain and real harm. It means you couldn't operate your business. It will mean you had great difficulty in operating your business. It caused you regulatory penalties to lose it, financial, customer churn. And you need to make that list. So you'll find when you make that list there'll be other data there that is irrelevant, you don't need to protect, because it turned out that's only part of a supply chain data, or it's data that is useless to someone. Do the inventory of what data is most valuable to your organisation, and not just valuable to your organisation, but also has value to someone else who may wish to steal it. Remember that there are organisations out there that trade on fragments of information. So your whole piece of data may not be what they're after, but that may be the jigsaw, parts of your data may be the jigsaw. And once you've done that, know the value of your data, it'll then start to calibrate, and then as we move through the nodes, you'll see what happens with it. But you'll then start to focus on that is where your attention should be in terms of where you apply your cybersecurity tools and awareness regimes. The next no is know who has access to your data, and we find that's often a really interesting one to talk about. So this is about who has access both within and external to your organisation, who can actually look at your data on your systems. So that's not just your teams or your admin support, but who has sysadmin access to your email. Is it managed internally? Is it managed internally but operated externally? You need to know who has sysadmin access rights and who actually has access. Is it the IT team? Is it your incident response team? Is it you've got a whole raft of admin users across the company? That's important because it's important for a few reasons. You always should know how many people have access to your data, But often the person targeted by other outside influencers or cyber criminals or others is the person who has sysadmin rights. Because once an organisation can get access to super user access, they can then move around an entire company's network because they've got super user access. So it's important to understand that those people sometimes can be targeted because of the access to information they have. And it's important that the right people have access to data. So that also means when you have staff that no longer need to be part of teams, shut down their access to certain sites. When you have employees that leave your company or perhaps you're part of the company, make sure that their access to certain data is then restricted. Make sure you regularly review access rights to data and your organisation. When you have employees leave, that you make sure their access stops on the day they leave. It's really important to keep that refreshed because that's often where you find people with open-ended access, or you don't know how they're coming in and getting access to documents and valuable information, can often be a blind spot for organisations. The next one is know where your data is. So where it's stored, but is it with a service provider? And also, have you given it to your third party? Look at where it is, not just in Australia or not just within your organisation, but where is it across the globe? You'd often be surprised that companies might subcontract part of their contract for you with another company, and in doing so give part of your data or all of your data to another organisation you have no visibility of. It's really important that you know the footprint of your data across the globe, and importantly, there may be your data in jurisdictions, your important data, you don't want in those jurisdictions for a range of reasons. So it's really important that your supply chain understands the 5 no's as you do. They understand the value of your data. They too limit access to your data, and importantly, you know exactly where it is and where it is in the globe, and that they're not subcontracting it without you knowing about it. The 4th no is protecting your data. So this is who is protecting it and the security processes that they're using it, and where are they, and could you contact them if you needed to. It's important that if that function is done internally, you know who's doing it, as at 24/7, but it's important that if it's external, you can name the provider who's doing it, your organisation knows where it is, they're contactable. In the event that something happens to them, are they able to tell you about the data and its confidentiality, integrity and availability? So it's really important that there's a life cycle management process there to understand who is protecting your data and accessibility to that data. And the 5th no is knowing how well it's protected. So it's all very well perhaps you might have a 24/7 SOC, or you might have outsourced that capability, but it's one thing to have that capability, but the 5th no is about, are the right people watching the alerts as they come on the screen? It's all very well having people there on the dashboard at the flight deck, but they need to also do something when the red light flashes. They don't need to look at the screen and go, oh, there's an alert coming. Oh, well, we'll just close off that one. It's really important that the team understand what's important to you and your organisation, which kind of gets back to number 1. They need to know what valuable data they're protecting, what alerts to look out for, what alerts do they jump out of the chair for, what's important when an incident's raised. Importantly, for your supply chain, it's important that if your data is breached, that is one of your suppliers has a hack or attack, that they contact you, and there are provisions that they contact you if some of your valuable data is stolen, and that you're woken up. And in turn, you can wake up your CEO or your management team to let them know. That's a really important part that I often find, that in negotiations with third parties, you need to be notified in the event of a breach, and notified promptly. You don't want to find out about it in the paper the next morning. Importantly, you also need to know how well it's protected, because you may need access to logs and access to evidence about what happened, how far and wide is it spread, when was it taken, can you tell us how often? And companies need to understand that. They also need to have security incident management processes in place. So from a 5 no's perspective, once you do that, and even if you sat down with the leadership team for 1 or 2 hours, you should be able to then work out, and they should be able to understand, and they don't need to be technical at all, what is our valuable information, how is it protected, who has access to it, and how well is it being protected. And those essential points are vital to being able to then get a handle on where are our gaps in our organisation, where do we think the gaps exist in those 5 no's. The gap number one might simply be we don't really know what our valuable data is, or we think there are parts that are valuable, but we're not sure. We need to do work on that. This is really an approach that allows you to work out how well you think your organisation might be on top of this. Some of them may well be very on top of this. And others to say, we're not quite sure how this is being done, but we're going to find out. And it's important that at the end of that process, you may have all the answers you need, and that's terrific. But we certainly, from the other end of it, have suggested to senior managers, the boards and CEOs need to be asking these questions. They need to demand that their CIOs or CISOs or teams understand these 5 no's and can answer them if ever asked in a leadership meeting. So even the exercise of going through it is a really important one, because it can then help you flush out where are the gaps both in an awareness and a technical perspective. Are we fine? We think we're great, and we can report out on this. And there are options there at the back end of it. What we do at Telstra is we have operational security requirements that sit at the back end of that. So 8 or 9 things we have that we think are really important from a technical perspective, and I won't get all technical on everyone because I'm not that technical myself, but we can then test these to see, well, you've said you understand and you said you tell us not many people have access. Tell us how that is, and we go into sort of a bit of a more probing investigation on that. So that is really all I wanted to say from a sort of a formal sense on the 5 no's and how we approach it. And I'm very happy to take questions on that and anything people might wish to say about it or their approaches or how they've been able to or not able to engage their senior leaders on cyber security.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel. I did have a question just come in from Zahir that relates to something you just mentioned, which was the logs and the tracking and all the background information. He asks, how do we manage the challenge of translating logs into a language where everyone can understand? The challenge is always with storage capacity and what types of logs should be enabled. Where do you start there?
Well, it's a good question. There are often people in technical teams will understand the need for logging. So I find it's often helpful to get someone who's less techie but has lived through breaches. We've got a few people who are excellent at incident response, and getting them to say, look, what we need often in the event of an incident is we need to know how many times the data was accessed. We need to be able to go back 3 months to see, because usually 3 to 6 months you can tell if it's a long-term intrusion. You get incident response people are usually really good at being able to explain that in real-time, plain language, what they need and why they need it, because then they often say, we need that kind of history because it will tell us how many people or how long this person or perpetrator has been sitting waiting for the data or taking the data. We need to then be able to go up to our CEO and say, we know that they've got in from Ikistan, we know how many times they've got in, we think our data was taken on these dates, we know they've taken this kind of data, we think. But it needs someone who's lived that experience, I would say, to then be able to say, often either they're very good, they can do that themselves, or they go usually through a CISO or a cybersecurity officer to get it kind of, inverted commas, translated. But my advice would be always go to people who've lived through, and when I say lived through incidents, they're the guys who get out of bed at 1 in the morning, because the first things they'll ask for are often, show us your logs. Going just a step, hindsight's a wonderful thing. What you do now, if you've lived through that, the dream of an incident, is when you're negotiating a contract for a vendor at another end, and you know it's something that they may be handling very sensitive data, you ask them that you then become very prescriptive about the access logs you want in the event of an incident. So you set it up so that you say, we want access logs kept for a minimum of 6 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, and they must have the following, or to the extent you can ever get this, because some are quite locked in, you can't be prescriptive. But then you say, it's really important for us that you're, in the event of an incident, we are able to see X, Y, and Z. So that kind of hindsight helps when you're negotiating contracts, and you can ask your technical people for that, because you can forward think, what will I need if I'm going to have to brief our CEO? What kind of information am I going to need to be able to tell him or her at 3 in the morning when I'm making that phone call?
So obviously a lot of this deals with the people that you have within your team. How do you create a security-aware culture so that everybody takes ownership of this and doesn't find workarounds that may put the business at risk?
That's a great question. Look, I think the first thing is you have a team like I have, so I'm the head of cyber influence, and I have a great team of really capable people, and their job, and they are all non-technical, their job is really working every day on different ways we can raise awareness. We have intranet articles we pick out, we run campaigns, we work with teams, we collaborate, we go and present. We certainly work hard to things like shadow IT, which is what you've touched on. People often want to get their job done, but just download programs because it's easier rather than going through corporate IT. We try and get data and stats from our technical teams to draw that out into narratives and stories around, hey, do you know that when you download stuff like this, it's really bad because, or it doesn't work for Telstra because. So it's really important that you stock your team up with non-technical people who are great at taking data and stats and turning it into narratives and stories that normal people can, that everyone can understand. So they don't feel like they're being punished, but they're being made aware. I didn't realise when I put my documents in Dropbox that that's an external cloud solution. I don't have control of it. I didn't realise that. And so helping them understand, oh my goodness, I just simply didn't realise that. 99.9% of people, when you chat to them, are like, I just didn't realise. That's a common, I'm so sorry, I didn't realise. So it's about us helping raise the levels of realisation, if you like, around that kind of thing. Simple things that they could do to maybe help their work lives, but don't place customer and corporate data at risk.
Well, when you have a cultural change like this, there's obviously going to be some time that it's going to take to change over. But in terms of the 5 no's, how long should we expect, the process to take from ideation to really having everything locked down?
Well, that really depends. It depends on the size of your organisation. For something like Telstra, it's just like trying to turn the Titanic around. So it can be a 1 to 2 year process depending on how quickly you get through it. For a really small organisation, it would take a matter of a couple of months because you've got to talk about it with your team, you've got to go through the process, what the first no is for your organisation if you're a small organisation. Then you've got to go out to your suppliers and your vendors and do a little probing with them and kind of put them on the 5 no's. That can take a bit of time between getting questionnaires back and answering them. So it kind of depends how deep you want to go or how light touch and really what an organisation wants. It's something you need to feel a way for. There'll be organisations who don't need the big Rolls-Royce approach and others who really feel they may want to. But I think once you just do the first 5 no's, talk with a senior team, then you'll become apparent how far you want to go with it and where you want to reach out to with your vendors or how far. It may just be people want to do it internally within an organisation and don't want to go out much further.
So say you're in a position, and Jim has this question, which is so you've had the first conversation about cybersecurity. When do you go back when you see things aren't progressing? How do you have that conversation that is not in an annoying way so that you're not the guy who's constantly saying, oh, what about cybersecurity? What about cybersecurity? But still get that message across to your leadership team.
I think it's constantly about saying, keeping maybe, it's a hard one. I think keeping alive to the 5 no's, tethering it to the 5 no's we've found has been very successful because we always come back to, it's top of mind, it's topical. Another way is cybersecurity doesn't stop and end with the 5 no's. It's always something that people are building into their processes and practice. So it almost needs to be a standing item on board papers and management risk committees and leadership papers. So it doesn't just become, hi, I'm the annoying cybersecurity guy here to do a report again. That it's baked into all practices across the company, your product development, your app development, your HR practices, your legal practices, and everything you do, because mostly it's all online and facing, HR data and employee data is stored somewhere often. So it's about keeping it alive in a way that isn't chastising, isn't punishing, you're not the headmaster, but it's around, we've always got to constantly know the value of our data. This isn't static because new bits will come into that assessment of column 1. Within 6 months, I'm sure there'll be new data that was valuable that wasn't valuable 6 months ago kind of thing. So it's a constant conversation and it's a bit like health. You don't kind of let your health go. You kind of constantly keep on top of it and hopefully keep abreast of new developments or what you need to do to remain healthy.
Right. Just because the doctor's told you once you need to quit smoking doesn't mean, well, that you're fine from here on out. You do need to check back in on it.
Yeah, there's always cybersecurity health effects. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Brett has a question that it kind of builds off something we asked earlier. A lot of the things that we've talked about thus far are process and procedure, are things that you can do at I don't want to say a low cost, but a fairly limited cost. He's got a question, and what would you recommend for what percentage of total business revenue should be spent on security?
Oh, well, I'd love it if I had a crystal ball to answer that one. I'd say it depends again. I think I'm often asked how much is enough. It's a common question. I would say, again, if you've done a 5 no's exercise kind of thing lately or you've done a due diligence and worked out your gaps, always just look at the spend that you're going in for effective security outcomes and that you look at your suite of tools and that they're all perfectly complemented. You don't have sort of some that are the same when you could kind of have a suite. I'd say the beauty of the 5 no's is often that you do that and you can work out your gaps. So you augment the gaps, but simply responding to security incidents with doubling budget isn't always the way to do it. Some companies are brilliant on the tools, but they haven't invested in employee awareness. So I think it's really about balancing the two. Have you got the right tools in place that allow your people to do the job they need to do? Have you also raised awareness in the company and spend money on that? Raising awareness isn't just about handing out pamphlets downstairs in your foyer. Raising awareness is a real commitment. It actually takes time to build online courses. It takes time to do graphics and takes time to come up with things. It takes time and investment and in teams, in people. It's an expense that you can't always measure ROI on. But I would urge people to say, just because it's not a shiny technical tool doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. It's amazing how much you can do by raising awareness on the back of doing presentations or publications in newspapers, how much you can influence your own organisation by doing op-ed pieces and white papers. So that investment in that human element and that the advocates, finding advocates, there are lots of ways to keep it topical and keep that investment, because people will start to sink in, but it is very much cultural change. But I just find when there's a real emphasis on tools, people think, oh, well, a great example is McAfee, or not picking on them, but any antivirus protection, there's an assumption they'll pick up every phishing email that comes in an organisation. We know that's not true. We all get phishing emails. So you can't rely on the tools to be that first line of defence always. Tools and people will stop phishing emails from being successful.
That's interesting you bring up the education point, because I took a course when I signed up for the Enterprise Box here at Telstra through our My IT program for education just about cloud storage. And yes, I'm sometimes frustrated by the two-factor authentication that you have to do. It is a bit of a burden to get in sometimes to the Box account. But frankly, I had no idea. I think I'm like every other person who just thinks, well, it goes into the cloud and therefore it's safe, or it's secure, it's stored somewhere. But really, where do those ones and zeros go?
That's exactly right, and I think we did deliberately do the cloud course, and that's actually right. And there was a lot going into the Box collaboration, which was terrific. But again, I would say to cloud people, use cloud storage providers; they're brilliant. But don't put your recipe for your secret chicken in there if you guard it closely. Not because I'm saying that there are malicious people who own clouds, not at all. It's just you don't know who has access, and some cloud services may be hacked. You don't know who has access to them. So I just think you never store something so far away from you that is vital for your organisation. The other thing with cloud storage is if we have staff or any staff in any organisation put vital documents there, you don't know what is in there. If that staff member resigns or goes, you've just got no concept of what valuable information might be out there in cloud storage that you simply are unaware of. So it's that concept of what you value most, you don't put far from the company. And I would just say, if you've got that secret recipe for your grandmother's chicken and that is how you've built your restaurant empire, then keep it close. Put it somewhere very close to you.
One of the things you mentioned right at the beginning of the talk was about who did this, and does that matter? It was fascinating, I think, to learn that North Korea was at least supposedly behind the Sony Pictures attack. But ultimately, you're right, that doesn't really matter. So in terms of reclamation of data, how do you, somebody breaks into your house, using the physical analogy. If you find them, they likely still have your TV, or at least know what happened with it. What about, if there is a breach? Hopefully there's never a breach, but if there is going after someone going to get that back for you?
No, that's absolutely right, and in cyber, absolutely not. I think you're absolutely right. There's always that fascination. It's part of our DNA, right? We always want to know who done it. It's just part of how we're made up. It's the ultimate question in any crime. But you're right. You're not going to know necessarily. And even if you do find out it was somewhere in Ikistan, you're not going to get your identity back that quickly, because it would have been rehashed and reused and sliced and diced. So I think the focus is always obviously trying to find out what happened, which is important from a personal perspective or a corporate perspective. But no, I suggest that there are probably other agendas at play when there are high-level games being played like that in various countries. But I think the important thing is to focus on, there's no doubt that attribution is important for us. It's important for companies to know, and it's important for companies to share that information where they can, because that helps everyone. So if companies share, then they can share signatures, and that's important. They feed that back to relevant government organisations, so that we don't necessarily need to know who who was the victim of that scam, but it's important that we all know those signatures so we can all share and that intelligence can be shared. I'm all in favour of that because I think the more sharing goes on at that level, from a technical level, then we all become stronger. So, and that goes on today between organisations. But focusing on who done it, you may get your TV back in the real world. You're less likely to get your virtual TV back or your virtual coins or your virtual documents. It just won't happen. It doesn't happen like that. So there's no point really at that stage investing in attribution distraction. I do think it's important though in some cases to share where relevant with other organisations and government agencies, and I'd always urge organisations to do that and to seek that advice if they believe they need to, and that is certainly a matter for those organisations. But focusing on remediating the breach, stopping it and moving forward is always vital in the sort of hours after a breach.
Yeah, well, you may get that data back, but ultimately it's probably been replicated because it's just as easy as a right-click and copy-paste to lose all of that information or lose access to that information. We have a couple of minutes left for questions. So if you do have a question about cybersecurity, about your strategy, about where to start with that conversation, feel free to ask that in the question and answer box on your screen. In the interim, I do have a question for you in the audience, and that is, have you identified your key business assets? Yes, you're confident in your knowledge. Yes, but we haven't really quantified it. So we know what's out there, but not exactly. No, but we should and want to. No, but you don't know where to start. That's the question I have for you. I'll pull up those results right now, and it looks like 34.5% say no, but they should and want to. Let's just pull this into a practical realm. I've listened to this webcast. I am curious to have a conversation. Rachel, where do I start? I mean, what's my first step?
In what? In raising the in which step? Which was the question?
In having in identifying your business assets. Say I'm motivated now. I'm curious. I want to do something. I mean, do I have a conversation with somebody? Do I write an email to somebody? Where do I even start?
I would say write an email to either, if you have a Chief Information Security Officer, write to them, or a Chief Risk Officer and say, I really want to assess our company's valuable information to make sure it's being protected accordingly. How can I sit down with our leadership team and see that we've got assess what our valuable information is as a company, what do we think our valuable information is from a cyber perspective, and then take it from there. And you'll find people will start to sit down and go, yeah, it's our customer information, it's our customer list, but flush out. And sometimes it takes people, you need to do a few examples of that, but that will be where I'd start. But raise it with a Chief Risk Officer or a CISO, somebody who can help propel that conversation and tip it into a senior level.
I've had a couple of somewhat technical questions come in, and I'll bounce them off you, Rachel. And as you mentioned, you don't come at this from a technical perspective, which I think is great, because that means that those of us who are also not technical are able to have that conversation, at least start it and say, look, I'm worried, send it off to the Chief Risk Officer. And if the Chief Risk Officer comes back and says, look, we've also thought about this, then you've at least started the conversation and everybody's aware of it, which is excellent. But somebody's asked about something like Cryptolocker and Wall, and there are a bunch of different, I don't want to say rudimentary, but fairly standard cyber attacks. Is there a way to get in front of something like that and prevent it from happening in the first place?
Usually it's don't click on the links, don't click on the emails. Cryptolocker, it's generally spread around because it gets into organisations through a malicious email. I think the important thing is often they come thick and fast, so it's raising awareness about that. And Cryptolocker, I've read in the paper and magazines, organisations very small organisations have been completely crippled because they've had their data, they've clicked on links and their data has been basically removed from them and encrypted. Again, that's an awareness piece, being really alive to those scams, seeing the patterns and raising awareness about them. There's no technical shield for Cryptolocker other than once we find out what it is, we can stop it from activating. But for the most part, you can't. You click on a link and it starts to move around and infect and take. So it's raising awareness of that and raising awareness to seniors that goes on, and that's just part of unfortunately the arsenal now of the cyber criminal.
So we had a comment from Zahir saying we would like to have a session on asset classification. I think that's a great idea, just to go in, because it's easy to say I'm worried about my business, but if you're not even sure of what to look at, that might be a good idea.
Sure.
One last question. Go ahead. Sorry, Rachel.
No, that's right. Absolutely, asset classification is important, and it helps to break it down by segment too, what kind of sector the organisations are in, and how, and within their organisation whether they have information classification guidelines, because that will help as well. But yeah, absolutely. And off the top of my head, things like board papers, strategy paper, legal advice, they're all valuable information for a company. So that's sort of the start of it. But yeah, happy to do that.
Another question in from Scott says, without scaring executives, how do we communicate them in a way that makes them realize the risks of not taking security seriously? Because everybody's, now they've got locks on the doors, but the cybersecurity may not be as obvious a threat.
I absolutely agree. This is not about scaring people, but and it's about having a conversation where demonstrating that it is real. Unfortunately, there are fantastic examples every day, and when I mean fantastic, they're just unfortunate examples every day of breaches. It's every day in the paper, so it's certainly out there, and there are big ones where it shows us that people didn't have cyber security necessarily front of mind. There were the OPM breach in the US is one where unfortunately they were plagued by a lot of what appears to be legacy issues. So it can be about having a conversation about it's really important we get on top of our legacy issues in our patching. So without scaring them, just simply saying we're concerned that there are, the world is delivering up examples of breaches that are really unfortunate. Are we sure we've got our house in order from a patching perspective, from an operational perspective, from an awareness perspective? Because it seems that there are lots, and the breaches come in many different ways. They come either through malware, they come through malware on point of sale systems, they come through third parties. So are we as an organisation ready to accept we're at a mature state or a less mature state? I think, you don't want to get with executives into the threat, because it's too esoteric. Then it becomes too much of a, that could never happen to us. That's in the US. They're big organisations. That's not us. Who would want our data? It's about realising that, all sorts of businesses have all sorts of interesting and fascinating data that other people might like to have a look at. So it's just about saying, have we got our systems right? Just as you said, the real world analogy, you wouldn't let a bunch of strangers in to rifle through your filing cabinets. So why would you let people rifle through your cyber filing cabinets? If you value your business, how quickly could it diminish because your business was done over? I think that's the important thing to remember.
A couple of people have asked for a template to follow the 5 no's, because it is a very easy path, or at least easy to follow path. Is there a place you can point them to find out more information about the 5 no's?
We don't have a template per se. We have the 5 no's as I've explained them, but we can certainly get you something we've got from a collateral point of view to you to send out.
Excellent. And taking a look, see if there are any other questions that have popped in. From a technical perspective, we've been talking quite significantly just about people and process, but there are tools out there. And where would you recommend people go just to find out about the different tools that exist?
I think the great start for an organisation is certainly the Australian Signals Directorate with their top 4 mitigation strategies and their top 35, if you're even extra keen. That's always a great starting point, I think, just to see, are we doing the top 4 in our organisation that really will reduce the risk. That's a great start. And the ASD also produce great sort of fact sheets as well. We find them enormously helpful here. I would advise people to go there at first instance.
That's excellent. And it looks like we've wrapped up all the questions that we have. So, Rachael, I just want to give you the chance right now, just last takeaway. If we take away nothing else than this, what should we take back to the business today?
I think take back, cybersecurity is here to stay. This is not just a passing fad. This is not just put cyber in front of everything and you'll get money. It is a reality. People do need to be alive to it in a measured and reasonable way. I'd say please invest and please seek funds and invest for real and effective security outcomes, not just to tick the box that you've got cyber covered. It must always be about effective security outcomes.
And just one last thing that Richard posted a comment that I think is important is a consideration around storing critical data in the cloud. You don't know what it is stored next to, what else is in there. There may be high priority targets that are also within, even within your corporate cloud that may get picked off. So just there's a ton of different information that's out there. If you want to have that conversation, I would highly recommend, if you're a Telstra customer, reach out to your account executive and just have a conversation about cybersecurity, just because it's an important one to have. So that's going to do it for this Telstra Virtual Event. Thank you all for joining us here in the conversation today. Thank you to Rachael Falk, National Security Advisor, for taking us through the 5 no's. This has been fantastic and a ton of good information. If you missed anything, the session will be available on demand. You can click on the same link in about an hour or so and listen to it all over again. So that is going to do it for us here today. In just a moment, a survey will pop up. Let us know what you liked and what you would like to hear more of next time. I'm Justin Cleveland, and for Rachael Falk, this has been a Telstra Virtual Event.